Here now the readings. First, a section from Paul's letter to the Ephesians. From the 5th chapter, hear this word. Therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children, and walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. For once you were darkness, but now you are light in Christ. Walk as children of light, for the fruit of light is found in all that is good and right and true. And try to learn what is pleasing to the Lord. Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. For it is a shame even to speak of the things that they do in secret. But when anything is exposed by the light, it becomes visible. For anything that becomes visible is light. Therefore it is said, Awake, sleeper, arise from the dead, and Christ shall give you light. And then from the Gospels, hear this reading, our lectionary reading for this Sunday in Lent. Familiar story from Jesus, from Luke, the 15th chapter. Now the tax collectors and sinners were drawing near to him, and the Pharisees and scribes were murmuring, saying, This man receives sinners and eats with them. And he said, There was a man who had 2 sons. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that falls to me. And he divided his living between them. Not many days later, the younger son gathered all he had and took his leave into a far country, and there he squandered his property in loose living. And when he had spent everything, a great famine arose in that country, and he began to be in want. So he went and joined himself to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed swine. And he would gladly have fed on the pods that the swine ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, How many of my father's hired servants have bread enough and to spare, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. And he arose and came to his father. While he was yet a great distance away, his father saw him and had compassion, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and make merry. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and now is found. And they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field, and as he came and drew near to the house, he heard music and dancing, and called one of the servants and asked what this meant. He said to him, Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he has received him safe and sound. But he was angry and refused to go in. His father came out and entreated him, but he answered his father, Lo, these many years I've served you. I've never disobeyed your command, yet you never gave me a kid that I might make merry with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who has devoured your living with harlots, you killed for him the fatted calf. He said to him, Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. It was fitting to make merry and be glad, for this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost and is found. The grass withers and the flower fades, but the word of God shall stand forever. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Early this past week, I came home for lunch and had an experience that's not particularly atypical at our house. I walked in the door, and in the middle of the living room floor was this. And it looks like cotton balls, I know, but it's actually some sort of polyester. It's the stuffing from a dog toy. This is a fairly common occurrence for us. You come home and there it all is, kind of everywhere. And I'm greeted with my dog Kate. She's got this empty shell of what used to be a doggy chicken. She just got the skin. It's just the skin now. She's got it proudly presented to me with her wagging tail, as if to say, "Look, I have successfully completed my mission." She's an interesting dog in this sense that she is gentle and docile and calm, except for her toys. She is rough as she can be on those. She is relentless with those things, paws them, shakes them, tears at them until this happens. That's the way it goes for her. And as I was picking up the stuffing off the floor last Tuesday before lunch, it sort of struck me that what my dog Kate does to dog toys is a bit like what preachers tend to do to really good parables. We feel like it's our job to chew and paw and tear at them and get the stuffing all out. The more familiar they are, I think the harder we pick at them and the more we shake them. It's especially true, I think, in my own experience over the years with the parable of the prodigal son. It's one of those parables that's almost too familiar in the sense that we think we know what the stuffing is. We think we know what the core is for the prodigal son. Before it's even finished, we know how it's going to end, and we think we know what it's all about. I know it's true of me. I mean, when I preached this parable over the years, and I've preached it many, many times, I don't know how many, I always think the main stuffing of the parable is the stuffing of the sons. And the fact that while the sons have different dysfunctions, they are alike in one way, and that is that they both manage in their own way to get alienated or distanced from their father. That's the way I normally look at it. This is a parable about how not to live. Don't be like the younger son or the older son. They both, despite their differences of being off the track, they're both off the track, but they both do the same thing. They get separated from a father who loves them. The younger son, of course, is the most famous in his distance setting from the dad who loves him. His flaw, of course, is that he is self-absorbed and hedonistic and self-indulgent, and you know the story as well as I do. He bullies his father into giving him an inheritance early. Father, bid you divide the inheritance with me. What a thing to say to your father. Think about it. I mean, you're the same as dead to me. Let's just assume you're dead to me. Give me what would be coming to me after your demise, and I'll be on my way. And of course, you know the story. He takes his inheritance and goes to a far country where he blows it all in what the Bible discreetly calls dissolute living. You fill in the blank as to what he did. But you know, it doesn't work out doing all of that, of course, and eventually he hits bottom and comes to his senses and decides to go home, and he develops a plan, right? He's going to have a little speech about earning his way back into the household as a servant working for his dad, somehow hoping that arrangement, this new deal, will make it more acceptable to his father, at least a little less awkward, this potential reunion. And we're told about that in some detail. We're told that while he walks along the road on the way home, he kind of practices what he's going to say. Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer to be worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your... You can almost picture him walking along. Father, I'm no longer worthy to be said. Treat me as one of your hired sons. And we don't know how sincere this all is. We aren't sure. Has he really had a change of heart, or is this just another scam, that he's come up with to make his entrance back into the family a little easier and to keep him from starving? We don't know. And Jesus doesn't say. He just describes matter-of-factly, this is how things done. Here's a younger son, life in shambles, made a mess of things, and he's managed to set a great distance between himself and his father, who loves him, and also, presumably, he's set some distance between, his behavior has separated him from his own best self. So there's son number one. And then, of course, there's the older brother, who is no prize either. In some ways, the older son's smugness and sense of spiritual superiority and, jealousy, he's at least as obnoxious as the younger brother. I like what James Lowry, a theologian and scholar, says. He wrote somewhere that Jesus tended to have a lot more trouble, actually, with the older brother types than the younger brothers. I mean, the prideful older brother, at least the younger son knew that he was off the track. He knew eventually that he needed to do something different. But James Lowry notes, Jesus tended to get along pretty well with the more spectacular sinners of the day who knew of their need to change. But the older brother types, the scribes and the Pharisees who thought, we don't need anybody. How do you change somebody who thinks they've got it all together? How do you invite somebody to newness if they think they've already got life figured out? Their hearts like that are like vaults. You're not going to make much headway. So there they are. We have these two less than great brothers. And for the most part, I have treated the story as being mostly, that's the stuffing of the parable, Don't be like either one of them, the one who takes his father's love for granted and runs off and blows it all in some less than worthy cause, and don't be a smug, self-righteous older brother. That's been the stuffing that I tended to live on through the years. But I have to say, the longer I think about this parable, the more I'm starting to think that maybe, just maybe, the sons are just kind of a backdrop. They might just be the minor players. And in fact, the real stuffing is something else altogether. I mean, what if the sons are just the backdrop we use to see something that's really, I think, maybe more important? And that is the quality of the acceptance and love that's demonstrated by the Father. I wonder if maybe that's the central thing, because when you think about it, the story of the prodigal son in 15th chapter of Luke is actually just the third of three little lost and found stories, right? There are two lost and found stories come right before this. One is the story of the lost sheep, right? Sheep wanders away, shepherd leaves everything and gets the sheep back, brings it back, and then rejoices. Who's the focus of that? Certainly not the sheep is the focus. It's the shepherd, right? Who leaves everything to go get the sheep. Next story of the lost coin. Woman loses a coin, searches the whole house for the coin. The actor in the story is not the coin. It's just sort of the backdrop to see how diligently and how energetically and how this woman will leave no stone unturned until that coin is brought back, in which case there is rejoicing. And now, it's the sons who've gotten lost. And shouldn't the focus, I think, the focus should be not on them, but on the Father and the lengths to which he'll go to get things straightened out. I mean, if you look up the word prodigal in the dictionary, prodigal literally means extravagant, right? That's what prodigal means. And so you could make a case that the one who is most prodigal, most extravagant in the parable is not the sons, but the Father, who is extravagant in love that struck them beyond anything they might have imagined. And I think maybe it's the idea that we're called to imitate a father like that, who's able to love both sons when they are absolutely unlovable, and to be able to extend that to others in our own lives. I mean, it's amazing when you think about the kind of response the father makes. The young son, who's rehearsing his I'm sorry speech on the way home, really never gets to give it in earnest, because as soon as he is seen coming from the distance, right, the father opens his arms and starts running toward him. And of course, in the first century, everybody would know what an exceptional thing that is, because fathers and elders in the village never ran. They never ran anywhere. I mean, they wore heavy robes, so think about this, awkward. He'd hike up his robe and run. It'd be embarrassing. Aristotle, dignified men never run. That just never happened in those days. Father runs. So the son knows from the first sighting of the father, before the speech is ever given, what his answer is going to be, right? Arms are open. The father running toward him. And later that same evening, After things have blown up with the elder son, he's at his worst, sulking on the porch, feeling jealous over the party that's going on. Again, who makes the first move? He doesn't go to the father to complain. Father comes to him and says, come in. Son, everything I have is yours. Please don't act this way. I think really the prodigal of the story, the extravagant one in the story, is actually the father. And I think the central question that Jesus wanted those first listeners to this parable to ask themselves, in light of all that, is clear. Am I willing to become like this father? Am I willing to imitate the way God responds, not with judgment, but with grace and with an initiative-taking love that says, no, I'm not going to look down my nose at you. I'm going to love people who I even find hard to love. Are you willing, I think Jesus wanted us to ask, are you willing to imitate the Father in how you see others? Not primarily eyeing them for their faults or their flaws, but approaching them with a love that takes initiative and that will move toward them and let them know they're cared about, and that the starting premise for all of us is that we are alike in our need for grace and forgiveness, and there's not a spiritual hierarchy. There's not some that are more by their virtue, as Angie aptly said, not by virtue of how many trophies we've run, how close we are to God. I think that's what Paul had in mind when he wrote what he wrote to the Ephesians. Be imitators of God. That's what Paul says. Be imitators of God, which is a tall order, I admit, but Paul thought it was possible and coached that for the early church. I think we don't talk about that very much in our modern culture because our culture doesn't value imitation as much as individuality, right? I mean, we trot out, be your own person and, break the mold with your, the way you do things. We like that myth of being a rugged individualist who blazes his or her own trail, they broke the mold when they make you, man. But the truth is that it's always been the case that people, we get molded in ways, whether we like it or not. We get molded by those around us, much more than we like to acknowledge. I mean, how do we learn to speak? By imitating our parents. We learn to walk by watching other kids. We create our own unique identity when we're teenagers. How do we create our unique identity as teenagers? Well, if you're like me, I watched what the cool kids did and tried to do what they did. That's how you become your own unique person in a lot of ways. I noticed as my own parenting went on through the years, how much my parenting became like the parenting of my parents. How did that happen? I couldn't believe it. And it happens throughout our life. We seek mentors in our professions, maybe, who we admire. We try to be like them. Many of the things that we imitate or that we conform to are innocent, our table manners, our taste in music, but others, I think, have a lot more significant fallout. Our work ethic, our attitude toward other people different from us, our spirituality, those things too, I think, get picked up in a lot of ways for others. And it's not too much, I think, to say that in many aspects of life, we are what we imitate. We are what we imitate. We get our bearings from other people. And it's a significant thing, I think, then, that Paul says, know that you have the capacity to connect deeply and become more like the God who gave you life in the way that you love, in the way that you see life, in the way that you look at other people. We are what we imitate. And the closer we get to somebody, the more we are apt to look like them. Just one example of that I saw this week on the internet. I was making a little surf, and something that made me smile was a website with photos of dogs that look like their owners. Have you ever seen a living? If you ever want an example of how being close to somebody, you start to look more like them. You ought to go to. I asked Molly to just pull a couple of these up, and she did for me. Will you throw these up? A dog. You get close to somebody, just roll through. Just there's a few of them. It struck me. Yeah, right. Yeah, thanks. So here's my question, out of the parable today. Can you imitate the love of the prodigal father? Can you imitate that love? Who do you imitate? Who do you imitate? And I guess maybe by extension, who's imitating you these days? I mean, that's a really important question. It comes out of this parable, I think. I think Jesus told it not just so that we would avoid the pitfalls of being either an older or a younger son, but I think he expected us to have that kind of love that runs toward people who maybe are having difficulty in life or who've gotten off the track. And there's no more powerful example. You know, who was it who said, I would rather see a sermon any day than hear one? And I think part of that is that idea of you see somebody who really imitates the love of God, the most powerful witness the church can ever have. One of the best stories I ever heard about a divine imitation came in the form of a dinner party I attended once. I went with my friend Don Messer. Don Messer, a retired seminary president, came here years ago and preached for us and invited me to go with him to do some workshops in seminaries in southern India, which I was happy to get to do. It was a great experience in my life. We went there and did a couple of workshops in both in Chennai, India, and in Bangalore at the Protestant seminaries for students. This was at the time when the church was just kind of coming around to the idea of one of the roles that the church always has in society. At the time, there was a great stigma of people who had HIV/AIDS. You know, it was great consternation. Look, people were kind of stigmatizing them in a variety of ways, and it was the church's job to say, we're the church of open arms and open hearts and open doors, and people need to be regarded as children of worth, whatever their illness. And we went to India and did these little seminars on how important the church, because it was really a big deal in South Asia. People were heavily stigmatized who were HIV positive or who had AIDS. And we did these workshops about mistakes that we had made. We hadn't spoken up enough in the church, we said, about the way in which the church needs to say, God's grace is extended to all. And in the course of that time there, I had dinner at the home of a physician who worked with HIV patients. His name was N.M. Samuel. He had Don and I over at his dinner. He lived on right on the coast of the Indian Ocean. It was a beautiful place. We had dinner, and he told us this story that was kind of amazing to me. It's a story about a man named Ashok Pillai, who was an officer in the Indian Navy, and had been regarded by everybody who knew him as bright and exceptional, good-hearted, caring. Consequently, he had a lot of friends. He had a lot of friends, that is, until the day it became public that Ashok Pillai had contracted HIV. He had had a blood transfusion, actually. That's how he got it. But when the word got out that he was HIV positive, his life changed dramatically. He was shunned by people who used to be his friends, especially, sadly, it was true in his church as well. He would go to church. Nobody would sit in the same pew with him. He was utterly ostracized and just left to his own. And at work, at the naval base, where nobody would eat with him in the dining hall, he sat alone at a table every day. And this weight of the stigma, he said, was far worse than having the disease itself, was just being ostracized, treated like a leper, basically. And life went on like that for him for several weeks, until one day he sat alone in the dining hall. There he was at breakfast, like always, sitting by himself at a table, and another sailor, a well-respected officer named Ravinder Rahate, broke the cycle of stigma and rejection. Ravi acted, I think, exactly like the prodigal father. He took the initiative. He went over and he sat down beside Ashok as he ate his meal, and all eyes in the dining hall were on these two at this point. And Ravi, this respected officer, reached over, and with his dinner fork, he took a piece of dosa, pancake basically, from Ashok's plate. That food that Ashok had already started eating, took a piece of that pancake, and he took a bite. And there was an audible gasp in the mess hall as that happened. And Ashok would later write, "It was the greatest gift any person ever gave to me. It was as if the wall of stone between myself and the rest of the world was in that one act torn down." And I think of that, what prompted the story of the prodigal son? It was a complaint from the Pharisees. This man eats with sinners and welcomes them. And I think about that story. It was, I think, a metaphor for the fact that there are so many ways you can get excluded in this world. There are so many people who are rejected or overlooked. And the parable came to the church as a way of saying, we're the ones to overcome that. We're the ones who've got the Father's love in our hearts and are called to go out and give that generously and boundlessly to show the world a faith that refuses to define itself by who should be kept out. I think that's really the bottom line of the parable. God has only us to do that work, only us. And as people who have ourselves found that love coming to us, the divine love welcoming us back from the far country when we've gotten off the track, can we really do anything else but say yes to him in this invitation to imitate that love day by day with others? Amen.